Ever since the introduction of the Unforgivable Curses, Cruciatus, Imperius, and Avada Kedavra, into the lexicon of wizarding lore, very few concepts have captivated and unnerved witches and wizards more than these three dark spells. Officially classified by the Ministry of Magic centuries ago, these curses are infamous for their lethality, their violation of free will, and their sheer capacity for pain. Yet, a curious question lingers in the minds of those who contemplate the evolution of magic. Why, despite centuries of magical progress and the emergence of countless new spells, potions, and enchantments, have no new curses been recognized as unforgivable? After all, given the limitless creativity of magical development, it's difficult to believe that no other magic could rival these original three in power or destructive intent. Is it possible that the failure to add to this list lies not in the limitations of magic itself, but rather in the intricacies of wizarding politics, fear, and social? To explore this, one must first consider the origins of the Unforgivable Curses themselves. These spells, unlike ordinary jinxes or even some of the more malicious hexes, were not created in isolated moments of experimentation or mere curiosity. Each one was born of intent so profound and so cruel that it transcended the boundaries of traditional spellwork. The Cruciatus curse, said to have been invented during a blood feud between ancient wizarding clans, was deliberately crafted not just to harm, but to obliterate the boundary between pain and sanity itself. The Imperius curse, on the other hand, epitomized the darkest form of control, used in secret during wars between wizards and goblins, effectively robbing its victims of any semblance of free will. And Avada Kedavra, whose incantation reportedly predates even Hogwarts, was designed solely for death, an elegant but merciless severing of life and soul. These three curses, therefore, were the culmination of centuries of specific, malicious intent. The Ministry's classification of them as unforgivable was less an act of discovery than one of acknowledgement. Wizards had always known when they were in the presence of a magic so dark it could not be tolerated, and the official decree simply enshrined that understanding in law. But this consolidation into three canonical spells also created a framework, a precedent that any new curses would have to meet, and therein lies the first critical barrier. When one considers the requirements of an unforgivable classification, it becomes clear that the standard is unnervingly narrow. To condemn a curse as unforgivable, it must not only violate the physical or moral integrity of its target, but also possess an inherent, specifically harmful function. A jinx that merely paralyzed an opponent, for example, might be deadly in a duel, but it wouldn't strip them of their autonomy, inflict psychological torment, or extinguish their life with the same certainty or finality as the Imperius, Cruciatus, or killing curses. Even baleful hexes, such as Sectum Sempra, remain outside this category because, devastating as they are, their effects fall short of the absolute malice required to meet the unforgivable threshold. Curiously, some argue that curses even darker than the trio might have already been developed in secret, but remain deliberately unacknowledged by modern authorities. Consider the string of hallucinatory spells used during Grindelwald's rise, or obscure enchantments allegedly buried deep within the archives of Durmstrang. Or could there be curse work lurking in hidden corners of the magical world that outstrips Avada Kedavra itself, but remains absent from ministry lists precisely because uncovering it would demand acknowledgement of its existence? Yet, for the ministry, ignorance can often serve as a convenient shield. To classify a curse as unforgivable is not only to denounce it, but also to admit to its use, perhaps even its origin, a fact fraught with political and moral implications. This leads us into complex legal and philosophical terrain. What happens when society or governments actively suppress magical knowledge, not out of altruism or moral clarity, but to protect their own institutional stability? A good example of this tension lies in the Department of Mysteries, long suspected of housing research into the intersection of magic and death. Despite its outward purpose as a center for academic discovery, whispers have circulated for years of experimental spells designed to test what separates life from non-life, including enchantments that might rival Avada Kedavra in their implications. But no records of such spells exist in public. They remain buried not because they are unknown, but because revealing them could destabilize the fragile equilibrium between Wizardkin's greatest fears and its self-constructed rules. In a broader sense, new Unforgivable Curses challenge not only the Ministry but the wizarding population at large to confront the darker side of its collective morality. There is, after all, a reason these three were codified centuries ago rather than more recently. The witches and wizards who lived during the wars and feuds that birthed them understood violence in a visceral way that modern society, with its relative peace, often seeks to forget. Declaring a new, unforgivable curse today would, in essence, demand an uncomfortable question. What has changed in wizardkind that we are crafting magic as dangerous, as malicious, and as invasive as those feared curses of old? Perhaps then, the lack of new classifications is less an absence of invention and more a deliberate effort to suppress acknowledgement of wizardkind's darker impulses. After Voldemort's reign of terror and the atrocities of the Second Wizarding War, the magical community yearns for an era defined by trust, a fragile bond that could fracture under the weight of new, wildly destructive magical discoveries. It is thus far easier, politically and culturally, to pretend that the boundaries of darkness remain neatly contained within pre-designated terms. The legendary trio of the Cruciatus, Imperius, and Killing Curses. And yet, history teaches us that suppression cannot last indefinitely. Ancient curses slept for centuries before being rediscovered, and magic follows its own inexorable currents, whether or not they align with human laws. The question then is not whether new spells exist, but how long wizarding society can maintain the illusion that it has mastered all its shadows. In the quiet crevices of castles, in obscure magical manuscripts, and in the whispered nightmares of those who probe too far into the nature of power and mortality, there may already be curses waiting for their names to join that infamous list. The role of fear in the stagnation of unforgivable classifications cannot be overstated. Fear, after all, is what grants the unforgivables their power. Fear of pain, fear of submission, fear of death. But the inverse is also true. Authorities fear legitimizing this power by acknowledging it. To declare a curse unforgivable is to shine a spotlight on it, to grant it a terrible sort of prestige, and to risk inspiring those who might seek it out for their own ends. For every witch or wizard deterred by the gravity of the designation, there could be another, tempted by the allure of wielding something so forbidden. It is not just the curse itself that carries weight, but the nuance of its name, its status, the mythos built around it. Few understand this better than the Ministry of Magic, whose policies often betray a delicate balancing act between public safety and the suppression of dangerous curiosity. Unlike ancient times, when secrets were whispered behind castle walls or inscribed in runes only the privileged could read, the modern world has made magical knowledge increasingly accessible. Spell theory, potioneering, and even ritual magic exist in public libraries, open to witches and wizards of all calibers. The unsupervised exchange of knowledge through charmed journals, enchanted mirrors, or even muggle devices has created fertile ground for innovation, but also for unintended consequences. It is not lack of magical creativity that halts the rise of unforgivable curses. On the contrary, it may be the unrelenting momentum of this creativity that terrifies the establishment, leaving the Ministry scrambling to keep a lid on spells or curses too dangerous to fully understand, let alone control. There are whispers of spells that could easily qualify as unforgivable, yet the Ministry has declined to classify them officially. The so-called soul-binding curses, largely confined to folklore, are rumoured to tether the essence of one wizard to another, bleeding their magical cores dry over decades. Then there are tales of curses discovered in the tombs of ancient magical dynasties, designed to make their victims endure eternal wakefulness, or to trap their consciousnesses in a single unchanging moment of time. Genealogical records from pureblood families often reference such magics obliquely, hinting at rituals that might not only destroy lives, but warp reality itself. The Ministry's apparent unwillingness to investigate or validate these claims raises troubling questions. Are such curses too complex, too poorly understood, or too politically inconvenient to label? It is not only the Ministry that benefits from maintaining the current status quo. The broader wizarding public, though perhaps less conscious of it, is complicit in this unspoken pact of denial. Most witches and wizards would prefer to believe that the worst of magic has already been catalogued and contained. The very notion of new, monstrous spellwork emerging in the present day is profoundly unsettling, for it suggests that wizardkind might not have progressed morally or ethically as far as it likes to believe. A new classification of an unforgivable curse would not merely challenge perceptions of magical limitations, it would force an uncomfortable reckoning with the darker facets of the collective magical psyche. What kind of wizard, even in modern times, would invent such horrors? And what does it say about society at large that such impulses persist? The role of morality in spellcraft is another barrier to the creation, or at least the acknowledgement, of new unforgivables. Today's magical academia, with its rigorous ethical oversight, is a far cry from the lawless experimentation of earlier eras. Spell creation is scrutinized, controlled, and, in some cases, outright banned by government bodies, like the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. But even these restrictions cannot extinguish the darker instincts that drive certain witches and wizards. For every colloquium on non-verbal summoning charms or modifications to Protego, there exists a shadow segment of researchers who explore less savory applications of magical theory. These individuals, who often work in secret, are not bound by notions of propriety or restraint. Their work is hidden in grimoires bound with human sinew, preserved in vaults protected by enchantments so complex that even Gringotts would hesitate to breach them. And yet, for all the focus on magic's inventors, little attention is given to its victims, who ultimately bear the consequences of such horrors. After the Second Wizarding War, archives of testimonies from those affected by the Unforgivable Curses were collected in an effort to document the atrocities of Voldemort's followers. Some were reluctant to speak at all, their minds shattered beyond even the curative reach of Stentmungos. Others described effects that seemed eerily similar to curses not officially recognized. Spells that shattered their minds into fragmented memories, froze parts of their bodies in perpetual agony, or left them wandering the line between life and death. Were these atrocities the result of Avada Kedavra, Imperius, and Cruciatus alone, or had Death Eaters employed darker, unnamed magics? The Ministry's silence on such accounts suggests a deliberate effort to limit the conversation, curbing details that might demand further investigation into unacknowledged curse work. Indeed, if one were to dig deep into the archives of magical history, far beyond the confines of Ministry-approved texts, one might find references to curses that challenge the boundaries of what is known. In the Middle Ages, wizarding duelists often invoked death song spells, intended to cause irreversible despair in their opponents until they perished of their own accord. Such magics, though comparatively primitive in their execution, bear a resemblance to modern emotional curses thought to induce madness. Similarly, fragments of French magical manuscripts recovered from Grindelwald's stronghold in Nurmengard describe a mirthless hex capable of draining joy from all those within its vicinity, an effect devastating yet abstract enough to evade truly universal apprehension. Could these archaic, incomplete curses represent threads of spellwork that have yet to be fully woven? Perhaps the most controversial theory surrounding the lack of new unforgivables lies in the idea that magic, in its purest essence, is inherently neutral. The spells themselves are not dark or light, but tools shaped by the intent of the caster. By this reasoning, it is not magic that creates an unforgivable act, but the wizard who channels their malice into its casting. Is it therefore possible that the designation of a curse as unforgivable stems not from some intrinsic property of the spell, but from the socio-political need to draw lines in the moral sand? If so, then the absence of new classifications might say less about what magic is capable of, and more about the social and political systems that govern magical understanding. Still, the silence cannot last forever. History is replete with patterns of magical innovation born from conflict. And with each generation that passes, new threats inevitably emerge to challenge the established order. Would a new war give rise to spells designed to manipulate entire populations, wipe out magical bloodlines, or reshape the very fabric of thought? And if such spells were to be created, who would decide their classification? Would a ministry shackled by its burdens of secrecy and fear break its own silence to denounce these additions? Or would it again fold them into obscurity in a futile attempt to preserve the illusion of control? These are questions no one dares speak aloud, and yet they linger, as surely as the magic that hums unseen in the darkest corners of the wizarding world. Magic, like history, has a way of repeating itself. While the wizarding world clings to its definition of the 3 unforgivable curses as the ultimate expression of magical malevolence, whispers of spells that transcend these limits abound. Amidst this cautious denial lies an uncomfortable truth. The categories we use to define magic may no longer be sufficient to contain its evolution. However, wizards have always been creatures of tradition, and few traditions are more rigid or more fiercely guarded than the belief that the unforgivable curses are singular, unparalleled in their darkness. What would it take, then, to disrupt this narrative entirely? There are rumors, often dismissed as fantasy or conspiracy, of spells too volatile even to document. Spells that, when cast, consume both victim and caster in their wake, leaving behind a kind of magical void, impervious to repair. Certain accounts from auras stationed in the Arctic Circle tell of an incantation that entraps an individual's magical core within a crystalline structure, severing wand work forever. Others recall legends from Azkaban, claiming that some prisoners engaged in magical self-destruction so complete that no trace of their existence remained, not even their names on registry scrolls enchanted to record the dead. Are these stories mere exaggerations? Or are they evidence that darker magic exists outside the categories we construct to explain and control it? The difficulty, of course, lies in the source of these rumors. Historically, the Ministry has justified its secrecy regarding such aberrations as necessary to protect the population at large. But secrecy cannot always equal safety. If these magics truly exist, then the real threat may come not from the spells themselves, but from the Ministry's reluctance to study them. Ancient magical thinkers such as Emmerich's Witch warned that ignorance of a spell's mechanics only increased its ability to wreak havoc, suggesting in his writings that even light magic can grow corrupted if repeatedly brushed aside. But the Ministry has always erred on the side of fear, framing its silence as prudence and hoping its inaction will prevent the spread of dangerous ideas. What is often overlooked in discussions of such matters is the nature of invention itself. Magic, while shaped by intent, thrives on experimentation. It is whispered in academic circles that spells as simple as lumos evolved over centuries from primitive charms meant to ward off magical predators. If harmless light could emerge from trial and error, what might grow from unconstrained experimentation with curses? Some of the oldest families in wizarding Britain claim to guard such knowledge, passing it down in hushed rituals and ensuring that it never falls into hands ignorant of its weight. Yet secrecy is a brittle safeguard. It was, after all, the ambition of one man, Tom Riddle, that twisted the fragmentary theories of Horcrux creation into a means of near immortality. Subverting one of the most carefully hidden branches of dark magic in wizarding history, modern attitudes towards spell creation further complicate this dynamic. Once viewed as an essential part of magical innovation, the practice is today regarded with suspicion, even disdain by the broader community. The mere act of inventing a curse, no matter its purpose, carries negative connotations, as though the process imbues the caster with malevolence. This stigma has driven much of spell experimentation underground, concealed in private grimoires and taught through apprenticeships that demand silence. As a result, new curses are more likely to emerge in secret, far from the ethical oversight of regulated magical research. This clandestine development ensures that many such spells remain half-realized, dangerous to both caster and victim, and therefore all the more prone to misuse or mutation. The question of intent resurfaces here as well. To cast an unforgivable curse demands more than skill. It requires pure, unfiltered malice. This is the very attribute that makes the Cruciatus, Imperius, and Killing Curses so dreadful. They are direct expressions of a witch or wizard's thirst for domination, suffering, or death. But does this same threshold apply to spells that could inflict equal or greater harm? As a side effect, there are records of enchantments woven into magical objects whose effects could rival the sheer destructiveness of the unforgivable curses. Objects like the opal necklace, known to jinx anyone who touches it with certain death. Why then do such spells remain excluded from the list? Could it be that the designation of unforgivable requires not only harm, but also intent so vile that it forces society to confront its creator's moral failings? And if so, might this exclusion serve as another form of societal denial, a refusal to acknowledge malice too abstracted to point a finger at? Interestingly, this specific delineation between personal intent and the broader consequences of spellwork might explain why some of the most dangerous magics of the past remain only tangentially studied. Blood magic, for example, manipulates ties so fundamental to a person's existence, family, ancestry, and life itself, that it dwarfs even the philosophical threat posed by Cruciatus. And yet, despite countless examples ranging from sacrificial wards to blood oaths, it has never been classified as inherently unforgivable. Historically, defenders of blood magic have argued that it depends entirely on context. When used to save lives, it is noble. When used to bind unwilling participants, it becomes abhorrent. This malleability, both in outcome and perception, renders its inclusion in the unforgivable lexicon almost impossible. But it is precisely in this nuanced moral terrain that new unforgivable curses might be found. What if the next wave of dark magic treads the line between free will and coercion so finely that it defies conventional definition? Imagine a spell that forces its target into unrelenting doubt, stripping away their ability to make decisions by amplifying every possible consequence until their mental faculties unravel. Such magic might leave no visible scars, no incontrovertible proof of its existence. Yet its implications could rival, if not surpass, the sheer horror of Imperius. Such ambiguity might paralyze even the ministry. How does one regulate magic that exists in the realm of shadows and suggestions, where victimhood itself becomes difficult to articulate? The nuanced morality of new spellwork extends beyond the individual, seeping into collective magic as well. Consider the properties of group rituals, which harness intent amplified through numbers. Already, historical examples abound of dark covens pooling their magic to summon devastation far greater than any single wizard could muster. Grindelwald himself is rumored to have once experimented with such magic, attempting to mobilize enough wizard's energy to permanently sever magical bloodlines he deemed unworthy. Would an incantation born from such rituals necessarily become unforgivable? Or does the shared responsibility make it easier to conceal its true origin, diluting the culpability of any one caster? As the threshold for what defines an unforgivable becomes muddled by such complexities, one must also examine society's changing perception of magical crime itself. Where once the punishment for using one of the three great curses was execution or lifelong imprisonment, today the ministry applies a more measured, albeit no less grave, approach. Azkaban is no longer guarded by Dementors, and the Wizengamot seeks rehabilitative justice, even for those who have wielded Avada Kedavra. This cultural shift, fueled by a collective desire to move beyond the horrors of the Second Wizarding War, may well suppress the classification of new unforgivables, for fear of reigniting the punitive zeal that once governed magical law. In avoiding this, the ministry inadvertently fosters a blind spot, where dark magic continues to fester, unseen. However, as with so many things in wizarding history, the truth about new unforgivables will not likely remain hidden forever. Magical society evolves in cycles of discovery and denial, and sooner or later, something will force the conversation back into the open. Perhaps it will be a catastrophic event, an unanticipated use of a modern curse with consequences too vast to ignore. Or perhaps it will come from within, a scholar daring to re-examine the shadows of spell theory, or an aura uncovering ancient magics deemed too dangerous to name. Whatever the case, the notion of containment, that comfortable illusion the wizarding world has clung to since the days of the founders, may prove not only fragile, but disastrously naive. The classification of curses, and the absence of new unforgivable curses within that category, cuts to the heart of the wizarding world's relationship with its own moral boundaries. If one examines the language of the law surrounding these three spells, it is striking how deliberately the statutes emphasize the unique, irredeemable severity of these magics. But inherent in that fixation on the irredeemable lies the tacit suggestion that all other dark magic might, by contrast, be considered less profane, less dire, and thus less worthy of the same level of attention. This rigidity creates a conceptual plateau where wizarding society has convinced itself that the worst has already been identified, that there is no greater peril than what has already been named, Sakar. And so, in its desire for stability, it has unwittingly diminished its capacity to respond to the darker possibilities within its own craft. Yet, within the vast and uncharted realms of magic, there are curses whose danger lies not in their obvious cruelty, but in their insidious subtlety. Consider spells designed not for an immediate and violent outcome, but for life-altering, almost imperceptible effects. Whispered rumors from the libraries of academia speak of so-called identity hexes, capable of fracturing a person's memory like shards of glass, disassembling the self so thoroughly that even the victim cannot piece together who they once were. Would Wizarding Society recognize such a spell as unforgivable? Or would it, as has happened so often before, elude explicit categorization because its harm is too abstract to fit the neat metrics established by the infamous trio? The man took again. He cast his friendly spell again. One must also acknowledge the role of culture in shaping how darkness is perceived. Modern spellwork reflects a more restrained age, one in which the overt malice of curses such as Cruciatus is regarded with absolute abhorrence. But the magic of the new era isn't necessarily gentler. It has merely adapted to take subtler forms. Deadly potions indistinguishable from medicinal draughts, charms woven into magical artifacts that manipulate their wielders unawares, or rituals anchored in ancient curses that only reveal their targets long after the caster has moved on. All of these represent the evolution of wizarding ingenuity, yet they lack the raw, blatant audacity of a shouted Avada Kedavra, and, for that reason, remain outside the Ministry's crosshairs. Could it be that wizarding law itself struggles to keep pace with the mutating complexity of magical malice? The rigidity of the Ministry of Magic, for all its proclamations of foresight, often parallels the bureaucratic inertia of the wider wizarding world. To designate a curse as unforgivable would require legal reform, political debates, and adjustments to countless enforcement protocols. The Ministry, wary of the turmoil any such decision could provoke, may very well avoid confrontation altogether unless forced into action. This conservative stance, while politically expedient, leaves wizardkind increasingly vulnerable to spellwork that thrives in the murky spaces between legislation and practice. The outwardly benign silence surrounding the classification of curses also reflects the inner fears of every witch and wizard. To have one's magic bound by law, to be told that a particular incantation represents an irrevocable crossing of moral boundaries, is to confront the darker impulses lingering within. While the unforgivables are universally condemned, they are also universally known. Their names, their effects, their very infamy have written themselves into magical consciousness. But what if new spells awaited similar scrutiny, carrying with them an even greater resonance? Would the collective psyche of the wizarding world survive the acknowledgement that its potential for darkness remains unbridled? Historical precedent suggests otherwise. During Voldemort's reign, the fusion of ancient spellwork and modern ambition terrified wizarding society in large part because it disrupted the perceived dichotomy between the old ways and the new. If those dark magics, developed in secret and wielded with devastating intent, were capable of leaving a lasting scar upon Britain, what does that suggest about the continued existence of similar unknown magic in far-flung corners of the world? Spells tied to blood rituals, signatures of cursed artifacts, and enchantments of mind control employed by Grindelwald's followers are all reminders that darkness does not sleep. It adapts, biding its time until it is ready to resurface. In truth, the avoidance of new classifications is an act of self-preservation, almost superstitiously clinging to the belief that naming something gives it power. But magic itself adheres to no such limitations. For every curse that history records, there are likely dozens that remain unspoken, their formulas whispered through generations or left incomplete in the tattered remnants of forgotten grimoires. Some theorists argue, controversially, that magic operates as a form of collective unconsciousness. What one witch or wizard develops in isolation, another might independently discover through similar thought processes. By this reasoning, no curse, however vile, remains restricted to a single mind forever. Repression may delay its arrival, but it cannot prevent it. This raises an unavoidable question. If the magical community cannot truly contain the evolution of spells or the rediscovery of ancient magics, then what purpose does legal classification serve beyond enforcing an illusion of control? The unforgivable curses stand as a psychological barrier more than a practical one. For all the Ministry's warnings and punishments, these spells still find use. Voldemort's Death Eaters cast them freely. The Imperious Curse was even employed by Ministry officials under duress during the war. And yet, these breaches have done little to motivate the re-examination of the greater framework that governs their classification. It is easier, after all, to label a past generation as corrupt than to face the complexities of one's own. Time itself shifts the boundaries of what wizarding society considers tolerable. Spells and curses once outlawed under strict regulation, like certain forms of mind-mapping charms or necromantic seances, have been slowly reintroduced into scholarly research for their potential benefits. Conversely, magics once considered benign, like memory charms, have faced growing scrutiny for their ethical implications. This evolving moral lens implies that the unforgivable curses, far from being immutable in their infamy, exist within a context that could one day shift. Could it be, then, that wizardkind is not so far removed from a future where the definition of unforgivable expands or even fractures entirely? Legacies of darkness remain etched in stone, but stone too can erode. The wizarding community's insistence on the finite nature of its magical moral boundaries speaks more to its desire for simplicity than its grasp of reality. Somewhere, perhaps in an ancient ruin or buried beneath the whispers of spell creators experimenting alone, there is magic that defies categorization, magic that waits to be recognized as the product of intent, as cruel, as controlling, and as final as the cruciatus, imperious and killing curses. History teaches that suppression will never extinguish invention. Whether through necessity, war, or sheer inexorable curiosity, wizardkind will one day be forced to reckon with those unnamed spells. The list of the unforgivable may not remain a trio forever, but when the fourth name is finally inscribed, the world will face a new reckoning. The acknowledgement that the darkness within magic is not confined to the past, but is intrinsic, continuing, and perhaps inevitable.